Today we have gathered to thank the
Kawila. Hi guys, I know it's been a long day and everybody's probably ready to have some more food and get over to Urban Shaman for the opening and have a dance party and get sung to in beautiful Maori songs. So it's my pleasure to chair the last panel. I want to say thank you to everybody for bringing their good hearts and their good minds today. We're really excited. All of the panels and the dialogues have been excellent. And it's my pleasure to get to chair the final panel. First up is Jason Edward Lewis, who is the IIF director and a professor at Concordia University. And they were like, be brief, be brief. Scott Benison-Abannon is an Anishinaabe intermediate artist who is currently in our Insurgence Resurgence exhibition. Woo! Next up, we have Kawila Mahi. Yeah, whew. I was practicing. He was a Skins 5.0 participant, and he's a graduate student at the Hawaiian Studies at the University of Hawaii. And we have Dr. Noani Artista, who is also an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii. And finally, we have Dr. Jolene Rickard, who probably doesn't need much introduction at all, a fierce art historian and a beautiful person. So we will start.
Hello again, everybody. Good to see you again. How are you feeling? Yeah? Good, yeah. Last session, no coffee, no tea. Gotta get ourselves going. Okay, I'm gonna start off today. I'm gonna try to be brief. I'm gonna start off today with a video documentation of a collaborative piece that Scott Benison and I did in 2002 called Greetings from the Thanksgiving Address, Greetings from the Technological World. So,
Today we have gathered to thank the Creator for all our gifts. We have been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and all technological things. So now, we bring our minds together as one, and we give greetings and thanks. We are all thankful for the computer, the platform from which we can create and communicate. Daily, this tool enriches our lives. For this, we send greetings and thanks. Now our minds are one.
We give thanks for TCP/IP. With it, our computers can talk to each other across the continents and across cultures. Whether it's our voices speaking, our language typing, or our eyes seeing, TCP/IP guides the data where it needs to go. Packets are sent out, packets are received. All is in order. For this we give thanks. Now our minds are one.
We give thanks to the Internet, which allows us to be connected to each other, forming a web across our Mother Earth. We know its power in many forms: email, chat, newsgroups. With one mind, we send greetings and thanks to the spirit of the Internet. Now our minds are one.
We send greetings and thanks for C++ and Java and all other programming languages. They provide us with the means to speak intimately with our computers, to instruct them in how to transform electricity into information and emotion. Through them occurs the everyday magic of transubstantiating the word into form. Now our minds are one.
We turn our minds to digital imaging hardware, the scanners, digital still cameras, and digital video cameras. They transform the analog images of our world into the digital data of the computer world. They let us show each other what is in our minds and in our hearts. For these, we send our greetings and thanks. Now our minds are one.
We give thanks to the PIC chip and BASIC stamp, for they allow us to connect the virtual and the physical. They expand the senses we can make available to our computers, allowing them to sense somebody's breath or move objects around. We are grateful for their power and simplicity. Now our minds are one.
Now we turn toward non-linear editing. This way of working frees us to realize our thoughts in any order we may wish. Storytelling is made natural once again. With our minds gathered together, we give thanks and look forward to working with non-linear editing for many years to come. Now our minds are one.
We join together in giving thanks for Photoshop and Illustrator, and all the other tools for manipulating digital media. They represent the age-old power of bending and shaping, of using our hands to turn matter to our own ends. With them, we can rescue a blurry photograph, extract a voice from a noisy train station, and transform a Queen sample into Ice Ice Baby. Now our minds are one. We've now arrived at the place where we end our words. Of all the things we have named, it was not our intention to leave anything out. If something was forgotten, we leave it to each individual to send such greetings and thanks in their own way. Now our minds are one.
"15 years ago." So yeah, that was a flash piece, yeah, sorry about the sound, but that is what it is. So I wanted to show that today. I wasn't originally planning on showing that, but sort of over the last couple of days of the conference, it really kind of kept coming back to me, that piece. It's one of my favorite pieces that I've been involved in, and a big reason for that is I think it's only probably been in the last maybe 5 years or so that I really got it. I think people, artists here, sort of have had the experience of sort of making something and appreciating and sort of understanding why you're making it, and sort of a couple years later or 7 years later or whatever, realizing that maybe it was about something sort of different or something more than what you thought it was about when you made it. So I still think it is about what I was thinking about and Skawanati and I were thinking about at the time we made it, but I also think a lot about it now, because for me it was the first moment when I started thinking about the technology that we use in terms of our sort of kind of kin relationship to it, sort of in terms of how it is part of the life that we lead, how we can use it to shape our lives in the directions that we want, to communicate with the people in the way that we would like to, and to make relationships with people in new and interesting ways. And I think that as we go forward into the future, it's really important to kind of think in those terms. I think that it's one of the things that many indigenous cultures, certainly the ones I'm familiar with and from, have a very rich vocabulary for thinking about kinship and thinking about how to make kin with non-human relations. And that's a big part of what the Thanksgiving address is about, is sort of thinking about the relationships that we have with the natural world, the real Thanksgiving dress, not our little addendum there. I think as we go forward, it's really important, because part of what's happening is, as we all know, we're carrying around or we're interacting with devices that are becoming more and more, I would say, clever. I don't know if I'd say intelligent yet, but and are taking on aspects of sort of animacy and agency in really interesting and weird and sometimes scary and sometimes very wonderful ways. And as we sort of kind of move forward into a future, I really appreciated what Dr. Redbird said about, thinking about robots, right? And the sort of like in this future where these robots, the robots kind of take over a bunch of our work, is we're going to have some kind of relationship with these entities that we create. And that if we don't figure out a way to have healthy relationships with them, I think that things could possibly go badly. Not so much that I'm worried about Skynet or something like that, but more that if we sort of treat these entities that become increasingly intelligent, become increasingly sort of capable of interacting with us in really rich ways, that if we sort of continue to treat them essentially as slaves, that the real problem is it's gonna devalue human intelligence and human agency, and sort of bring back into the conversation sort of a whole kind of series of justifications for taking very complex beings in a way and basically using them simply to serve our ends. So actually, sorry, Evan, I meant to cue you on the next one. So I'm just gonna, this is some of my work, which I thought was important to show because it's kind of important to kind of understand where I'm coming from. This is from an exhibition 2-3 years ago now, and I'm just gonna let it play in the background while I make a couple other kind of smaller points, or brief points. So, you know, the idea of the future imaginary sort of came out of, you know, lots of different conversations and sort of thinking about the fact that, you know, kind of the mainstream culture has a really rich future imaginary in the sense that it's, you know, it's populated by Skynet, it's populated by Star Wars and Star Trek and Jules Verne and sort of this kind of long history from at least the beginning of the previous century in dreaming about the future in particular ways. And it's very intertwined with colonialism, right? So if you look at the development of science fiction as a genre, it's about sort of kind of how we can use technology to control and command and to conquer. And we think I think, I'll just speak for myself now, you know, I think it's really important, and Scott and I talked about this a little bit in the panel that we did on Tuesday night, right? It's really important that not only do we get more Native people sort of into the future imaginary, into our expectations of what the future might like, but get more Indigenous stories that are trying to imagine what that future might be like, so that the future that comes to us, or the future that's already happening, and we're just trying to get there, as Scott has talked about, that future is a future that we want. And then just finally, I want to talk about the conference a little bit. So one of the questions that I get is, so why is it called the future imaginary, not the Indigenous future imaginary? And a big reason for that kind of goes back to something that Wanda was talking about, and also Joy was talking about in terms of sort of both, you know, what happens when we center Indigenous language, what happens when we center Indigenous culture, what happens when we sort of take charge and insist that we're in charge. And the big reason why it's the future imaginary is that I didn't want this to be a secondary conversation to the conversation about the future, right? What I wanted to do is sort of create a space where we're the ones who are helping lead the charge, if not leading the charge, in imagining what that future imaginary might be. And we can invite people in to be part of our conversation, right? But not sort of start off with this idea of like, okay, we're over here on the side, this is just the Indigenous part, right? And it's sort of attached to this bigger future imaginary, but sort of really try to assert the idea that the future imaginary is ours, right? And this is part of where the phrase, you know, the future Indigenous came from, right? It's really sort of assert presence, assert vision, assert our dreams, and assert our own ability to create the futures that we want. And I think that's it, actually. Thought I had a really killer ending, but I think I sort of like stepped on my own ending. Is that true? Well, actually, no. I'll do one more thing. So I just want to do a quote from Hannah Donnelly, who is an Australian Aboriginal musician and author, and who engages in sort of Indigenous futurisms and future speculation. She says, "When I think about the future, I think about a place where I can create stories that haven't been colonized by others, in the sense that my present is very much controlled by our history. And in this future, I can imagine where we can flip that control. I'm also romanticizing my own sovereignty by allowing myself to do that, because it's a place where we can imagine ways that are better for Indigenous people." And the last 2 days has been so inspiring to me to see all the wonderful different ways that people here are thinking about the future and thinking about the Indigenous future. And I'm actually going to close with a pitch. That's why I wasn't sure. The pitch is we have a postdoc that has gone wanting for the last year. So if you know anybody that has finished their PhD within the last 5 years and they want to come and hang out with us and do some of the work that you've seen and stuff like that, send them to us and we will be very happy to talk to them. And also, any undergraduate or graduate students that want to come and study and do this sort of stuff, send them us too, because we want them, okay?
So I'm just going to sit down. Is that good, everyone? Yeah? Good. It's so bright. Jeez. Okay. So this is supposed to be on rotation. I'm not going to talk in particular about each body of work as a slideshow, but it should possibly be rotating. I'm not too sure. Well, it's not rotating, so I'll just leave it on this one because it's kind of relevant. There we go. So, Bonjour, Benesidijnikas, Maingan Dodem, Winnipeg Donji, Montreal Donji. My name is Scott. I'm originally from Winnipeg, or Northern Ontario, so I grew up here. I've lived in Montreal for the last almost 6 years. So it's really kind of interesting to sort of consider what the talk was going to be about. I mean, it's such an interesting and broad scope of a theme for this panel. It seems like it would be an easy one just because my last few works have been very sort of technology heavy. VR works, Blueberry Pie Under Martian Sky, Newlandia, and then this sort of this audio piece that's in Insurgence, Resurgence. Trying to sort of suss out what the important parts of that technology is for me as an artist and me as an Anishinaabe person. Initially I was thinking, well, the practical side of the technology, it was, like, it's easy to, I can put a whole art show on a USB stick, I can Dropbox a whole show, I don't have to pay for storage for things, And that really wasn't what appeals to me about the technology. Rolling back into this sort of conceptual stuff that my work deals with, it always kind of comes back to the language. And if you've heard Animikika 1097, that's upstairs, and then Blueberry Pie, which I think is playing tomorrow, the audio component is the language, and it's hugely important to both pieces, if not central to both pieces. And then yesterday, so part of that process, the background of that is that I worked with, for Blueberry Pie, I worked with a brilliant linguist, Alan Corbier, out in Manitoulin, Miching First Nations. And through sort of employing technology, because we couldn't fly, just because of schedules and stuff, we couldn't fly him to Concordia, and I couldn't fly out to Manitoulin to do the face-to-face work, but that's sort of an instance where that technology allowed me, as an artist and an Anishinaabe person, to connect with one of our very sort of special linguists. And that project was engaging Alan and a group of elders from Manitoulin to create new words for the future. So I'm not going to give a breakdown of what Blueberry Pie Under Martian Sky is right now, just because it's a little bit lengthy in terms of conceptually. But part of that is that you as the viewer are going kind of into the future a bit, and you're going to hear these narratives. And part of the idea was that you'll hear future Anishinaabe, and what would that look like? And so we worked with elders and linguists to sort of conceive of new words for like event horizon or reciprocity failure or gravity even, So he was really very excited, and he said that the elders were very excited to consider our relationship with the words in the world we live in, and that's really the foundation of Anishinaabe is how the words are put together really reflect how we put our worlds together. So the language itself becomes a world-making endeavor. And for me, I think that really connected in terms of how I use technology and what the power of, say, VR is that it's a world building. It has the capacity to be a world building technology. And for me, that gives it, it's a very dangerous technology too, but it's a very sort of liberating technology for Indigenous people and sort of for the process of decolonization. And then more on a personal note, I started thinking, well, that's the technology that I use connects communities. And the last panel was sort of, he summarized, the moderator summarized the fact that, you know, a lot of people that we've heard in the last couple of days have talked about the importance of community and the connections with community into the future. And for me, and that's just it. I think these technologies that we're using strengthen that connection and those bridges between communities, whether that's Anishinaabe Cree or Mohawk and Ojibwe or what have you, or Anishinaabe and Northern Ireland or Black communities in Australia, et cetera, et cetera. That sort of connection as an artist and an individual to these wider sort of communities and building those connections is sort of that world making from me. And I think it reflects all the way back here. So I'm very honored to be back here in my home territory, in my home community of Winnipeg. And last night at the brilliant cultural sort of show, I saw Mary Christian stand up and give sort of that welcoming prayer. And so when I was 17, when I just first moved to Winnipeg, she was my high school elder at Children of the Earth High School. No, elder, sorry, she was my principal, right? So she held this sort of, like, she was scary to me then, you know, and she's still kind of scary to me, you know, like, but in that place, in that school that she had created for all of us, and with help of the community, of course, but this is where the sort of language and the things that I think about the language now were given birth there, you know, some of those wonderful Indigenous teachers from Children of the Earth started that decolonization process very early for all of us lucky enough to go through that system. And I think that still really echoes through strongly through my position when I use technology, when I access communities and then work with communities. And so when I saw her last night, I was like, this is kind of brilliant and wonderful that like 20 years ago, I've known her for that long, you know, and that's a kind of a wonderful product of that technology because I can stay connected to this Winnipeg, my hometown, through just the use of technology and the creation of art. And so I think that, yeah, for me, that was just becoming on a personal level. It was that the use of that technology for the acquisition and reacquisition and relearning of languages is a super powerful tool, and that's sort of that component alone makes my use of technology and my sort of view of technology sort of essential to myself as an Anishinaabe person. There's tons more. Like once you start unpacking the role of technology, you can go on and on and on. But I think I just really wanted to just acknowledge my relationship with this community, my relationship to the technology, and relationship to Mary Christian, because I think that was really sort of brought me back 20 years and connected me to this community and to that relationship. So, yeah.
Nā o mākua mai ka rā hiki a ka rākau, mai ko oku i a ka halawai. Nā o mākua i a ka hina koa i a ka hinalo, i a ka akau i ka lani. O ki hā i ka lani, o e i ka lani, nunulu i ka lani, ka holo i ka lani. E ia ka pula pula o kou, o ke ia hale nei. E mālama o kou i a mākou. E ulu i ka lani, e ulu i ta honua, e ulu i ka pai aina o Hawaii. E ho mai ka ike, e ho mai ka ikaika, e ho mai ke aka mai, e ho mai ka maopopopono, e ho mai ka ike pāpālua, e ho mai ka mana. I would like to start off first by thanking everybody who have invited us and kept us and cared for us over this process. So Julie, Jason, Skawanati, and Jasmine have been extremely helpful in all of our processes in getting over here. And yeah, that's me. Kauilamahi. Yeah. So, Pa'ani Vikio, ludic sovereignty. So, Pa'ani Vikio, I'll start off by saying Pa'ani Vikio is a word that was invented in Hawaiian Immersion Program. And it's a word that we invented in the 1990s. And the Hawaiian Immersion Program is a system that actually came out of Koranga Rail and Te Kura Kaupapa o Te Kura Kaupapa Maori in Aotearoa. And the elders over there brought their system and protocol to bring immersion programs to Hawaii. So I would like to say tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa to our Maori cousins. And yeah, what does this have to do with Pokemon Blue? I want to be the very best, like no one ever was. So I'll start off by sharing a story. My first game that I ever played was actually Pokemon Blue when I was about 4 years old. And I spent hours playing this game. I just really liked the idea of going around and exploring the world. And I would spend hours and hours on end. And even some of my friends in the immersion school system, we were spending all our time playing these games, but we didn't know enough English because we only knew Hawaiian. So we'd do all of these great things in the game, but we wouldn't be able to save the game, so we'd have to reset every day, and we would do it every day. Yeah. So that kind of guided my investigation into Pa'ani Vikio, or Pa'ani Vikio Hawaii, and what are Hawaiian video games. And I'd like to explore this idea of decolonial technology as a decolonial tool through potentiality. And I'll start that by investigating colonial visions and colonial potentiality, and then dive into sovereign potentiality through technology. So this game, SSX Tricky, Aloha Ice Jam, is actually a game where you, sorry, I know, they're on both screens. I don't know why I'm looking back there. But in the game, you're in this particular level, you snowboard through a mountain and you go through the face of a ki'i or tiki. And these are the images of our gods and our ancestors that some singularly pray to, some familiarly pray to, and some communally pray to. And what the problem with this colonial imaginary is it creates a settler futurity, and it's a settler imaginary and mythification of mo'olelo Hawaii, or our stories. And this process of mythification and of our mo'olelo is really violent, and I call it a cultural drive-by, because they come by, they shoot at us, and like tourists and anthropologists and writers, they share stories about us, but they are not our stories. And this violent process is continued in other places in our life, and because of this colonial imaginary, and it's hard for indigenous people who don't have structural base of their indigenous knowledge and language and culture. They imagine that this is the truth about who they are, these projections, these colonial projections. Barbie supermodel. How many of you know Barbie? So Barbie Supermodel is actually a game from the 1990s. It was in 1992, I believe, and it was on PC. And in the game, you're a supermodel who explores the world over and goes through all these stages and levels and really ignore everybody around you. And you just, yeah, it's pretty interesting. But this is kind of going back to, well, there's this idea of ethnocide in Hawaii, and I really want to put emphasis on our relationships with more than human beings in our environment. And there's continuous bleaching of our environment, our culture, our story, our language, and our more than human relations. And you can see in the game, there is none of that presence besides the ocean that are inherently indigenous. And we do see surfboard and we do have surfing, but you don't see brown people surfing. It's all, yeah. And this, if you see in the background, that mountain range, it's called Le'ahi, and it's now come to be known as Diamond Head. And this is a world famous image now. When people think of Hawaii, they think of this image and they equate it with paradise. But in many of our mele and some of our genealogies and songs, we look to this place as a place of strong protest. So it's a really interesting engagement where everybody associates our land and that image specifically with paradise, while all these really ugly things are happening around us, and we're also protesting it by being present at the same time. Call of Duty Advanced War, recovery. So in the previous slide where we are looking at the mountain Le'ahi, we're actually on that mountain now in this game. Call of Duty Advanced War is actually a world famous game. Everybody kind of plays Call of Duty that's into first-person shooters. But what is problematic about this game is that it's a fight. So it's already problematic with the title of the map called Recovery. We're trying to recover from all these instances that are happening in our community through military gentrification and dispossession of our bodies. And what I mean by that is ancestral bones that have been documented in places are being desecrated, shot, bombed, and removed for the purpose of military war games. Through the American military and imperialism, we have the experience of our monarchy was overthrown in 1893 by American military, specifically the Marines, I believe. And this is just, we have to exchange with the military every day, and where some people want to escape from that exchange always have to be around the military. We don't even get that opportunity in video games anymore. And there's the first actual naval base, which was made in Hawaii, was only when there were only 1% of Oahu, was in Pu'uloa, now known as Pearl Harbor. But in the process of building it, they destroyed 36 lokoi'a, or fish farms, which we used for our subsistence lifestyle. And because of this process, we see this continued violence and violations, because now 40% of Oahu is occupied by military and military installations. And if you think about that, I think only 60% of Oahu is occupied by people. So that contextualizes how present and how much power and assertion the American military attempt to have on our bodies. And even within exchanges where I know our women and many men have to experience military men primarily, and they go out and make a point of like, oh, you're Native, I need to be with this person. Or, oh, this guy is Native, so we need to beat them up. And that is actually how gang culture started in Hawaii, because we needed to defend ourselves against American military. So they created and structured this very violent process, and now we can't even avoid this conversation or this exchange with the American military and American imperialism in video games. Heauho is the potentiality of an indigenous view. And that was a game that we created with Skins 5.0, which Jason and Skawanati hosted in Hawaii. And in the game, you are an androgynous figure who is in the family of a navigator in space, and we're space navigators now. But, well, if you guys know, Hokulea just finished their round trip around, well, they circumnavigated the world without technologies, so this is kind of the different version of navigation. But in the game, you leave home because you're in seek of your sister, because both of your grandfather is becoming sick. So in your journey to finding her, you discover an exchange with all of these places and beings, trying to find yourself as a navigator, but also trying to find her and both of your way home. And it was really rehabilitative to see these images of the da'i'a, the fish, the kalo, the taro, and the lehua flower, which relate to our cosmogonic genealogy. And while we are exploring the cosmos and seeing the subsistence lifestyle as an alternative to the previous visions that we saw. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about Olelo Hawaii recoding. And there were a lot of talks about recoding, and this is recoding as well. And I'm going to connect it to actually a couple of my projects that I'm doing on the side. So I'm doing a C+ and C# project where I'm trying to translate the coding language into All Hawaiian so that students who are invested in trying to stay exclusively in their language can use it to code and create new worlds without ever having to leave our language. And there are instances where the language is actually more appropriate than the English coding language. And I'm also doing a calendar project on iOS for iPhone for one of our elders. And her project, well, what she wanted to do was create a lunar calendar and put lunar salience or manners that are salient to her lunar calendar, and so which relate to prophecy, birth, omens, subsistence practices specific to each day of the moon or moon phase. And that's kind of another Olelo Hawaii recoding. And in these, if you look at the on the board, you see what this is basically an enactor. And one of the participants in our group, Nathan Nahina, I really enjoy what he did because he just, instead of going out of his way and really thinking about how do we include Hawaiian language in our code and how do we recode video games, he just did it. It wasn't really a process of, okay, let's be very democratic about what is going into creating this game and what is going to run this game. He just did it, and I really admire that because that's kind of a very sovereign act of refusal and assertion and creating. So, yeah. And we see, hui ohia, which is in Hawaiian, and na hui ohia, which is, it says what it is right here. And ohia set active and bloom ohia when you pass around. I'll show you what all of this does and looks like. And it looks like this. So when you do a hula move correctly, after you follow the Hi'iaka Poliopele, which is a goddess actually of one of our hula genealogies, and we have many, but this is a really interesting exchange and engagement because we don't typically have, we always think of our ancestors and goddesses as teaching us, but we don't always know how to visualize them. And this is a great process because you're learning these moves and you're visualizing it in real time, and you're getting this exchange with this goddess in a video game form. And yeah, this is actually the level I was on for, I was doing game design and sound design. And the really important thing that I thought was what video games has the potential to do is create, like I said, create, assert, and then refuse, assert, and create. And these are really sovereign acts. And through this process, we, after creating the video game, we asserted ourselves and made spatial tags and glyphs. Recollect, shout out to you. Through dancing with our ancestral knowledge and taking our ancestral knowledge with us into the future and sampling these ideas. And this creation is a really important process for us in rehabilitating what is going on in our lives and what has gone on and what continues to go on. And I'd like to close with actually another idea and potentiality or that happened already that is really important. So the Aloha Protocol, I'd like to thank first Jason for talking about this Aloha Protocol or the Aloha system first. And it's really important for all of us to know that anytime, well, if you take out your phone right now and text somebody, you're exchanging through indigenous language because you're exchanging through the Aloha Protocol. So when you use Wi-Fi, when you send a text, when you make a phone call, all of that is because Hawaiian language and the word aloha and the word menehune. So the world over, anytime that somebody says technologies aren't indigenous, they're wrong. But it's a really good way of contextualizing what is the future of technologies for decolonial futures, because we look to see what created it in the past. And this is actually created in 1968, 2 years before the internet really. Well, the internet used this as a base, and this continues to be the base for all internet and wireless exchange, and bringing the future to us in a cipher. And really, I think it's important to also note that our time and how we configure time is not really linear, and it's very much like a cipher, like a rap exchange, because you see the energy of ancestral energies and the descendants' energies coming together, and you all exchange in free form. And this exchange and tension is what aloha is to me. And that's why it's really important for us to think about time differently and use these unknown knowledges that are really important to us all the time. Mahalo.
Aloha mai kākou. Aloha ho'iwa i na poe nona ke iaina. A me na poe marama ia mākou i ka here ana mai ina i Jason, Skawanati, Julie, Jasmine, the people up in the box, Nancy, Pippin and Rila, who reorged my talk 5 minutes ago. Kilohana, seeking into the indigenous future, the mana of Mo'olelo. Can you play the video? That was the opening cinematic for the game Heauho. It seems fitting that the first game that deeply engages with Hawaiian culture, developed via Skins Workshop that Kawila and I participated in over July and August, begins with Heauho, a new world, with one of the most well-known Hawaiian chants, the Kumulipo, the origin in deep darkness, an allusion to the various blue-blacks of the deeps of Moananuiakea, the Pacific Ocean, and the emergence of life from the ocean, darkness into light. Although we did not begin designing the gameplay with this set of meanings of the Mo'olelo in mind, I have come to understand that what we have ho'okumu, given potential to grow, in starting the first Hawaiian skins game with this cosmogonic genealogy chant, is the beginning of what we hope to be a good and long relationship between we in Hawaii and our game design kumu in Montreal. Because that's what it means to have this origin and this connection. It's a genealogy chant. My experience of the chant as a student and professor always emphasized the words and their meaning. So what Scott's saying about the importance of language to what we do into the digital world, how we grow into that, it's always been really important. Words and their meanings, attention given to genre and structure. But as a chanter and a listener, engagement for me, like the chant we did up here, has always been kinesthetic and auditory and performative. But here in the game, the opening cinematic, which is admittedly, I don't know if you recognize, sort of kind of an intervisual or auditory. It's sort of intertextual, if you will, with the collaborative work of Maori artist Brett Graham's Maramatanga. I had a different experience of the chant again, as opening out a new world which we created together. This multiply-sensory way of engaging with the text over 20 years in my life exemplifies the mana in the title of the talk as branches to spread out different versions of something. Using technology as a decolonial tool, as many speakers have reflected over the last few days, for me, is to move deeper into our own practices, into language, land, and tradition. But before I tell you more about the game Heo Ho, I'll tell you about a project I've been working on over the last year and a half called 365 Days of Aloha, where I explore the myriad ways of expressing aloha in mele or song and oli in chant. And how am I gonna do this in a digital media context? You know, Kawila's over here talking about programming and this gaming thing, and you know, I brought more mo'olelo than I did game to the process. So I feel like I'm in that space where I'm like learning a new language and I feel really awkward. So I had to start really slow. Ooh. That's the wrong slide. Okay. Maybe can I just do that? And sort of, yeah, here, this is where I am. Wait, can I go backwards? How do I go backwards? There we go.
There we go.
That's my project.
Yeah. That's the project.
Now we got you Friday afternoon.
Happy hour is right after this. Or it could be now. From sexy times to Aloha 365. You feel me? Some of you talking about it. Is a Facebook social media project I started in 2015 that was comprised of a word a day with a translation of a word. Super simple, right? The idea came to me because, you know, I had this brother who was a healer, but who sort of knew very little about aloha, about how to be in relation to women around him in a respectful way. And so one day I woke up, January 1st, 2015, and the idea popped into my head, a word a day about aloha, since it doesn't just mean hello, goodbye, and I love you. And I thought, I could challenge myself. I could talk about aloha every day of the year. Every day of the year, I could come up with a new word, right? I told them, you know, just after I did the first one, just read it like you're taking a vitamin. Every day, just read my post on Facebook. It's easy. But then as I got more engaged with it. I got more enamored of the process. I started adding images to the words to illustrate the ideas of relationship visually. I also then found the words in mele or oli or songs or chants, and then I started looking for them in Hawaiian language newspapers online that are online now, or in popular tunes, and then translated the songs. I had a couple of helpers who would like pick up on days where I was super busy, but the archive of the material that we've translated right now, a lot of the material we translated have never been translated. And I did that because most of my community, like 90% of Hawaiians, can't speak or read Hawaiian. But I didn't realize how hard it would be to do this until this happened to me. This is the crisis. What do you think? What's wrong with these pictures? Aloha, sexy time. Like, what are you feeling? Oh, who is that person? Of course, Skawanati. Well, so, I put in, aloha, love, something, maoli, kanaka maoli, Hawaiian people, and I get this. This is what would come up, this is what Google would spit back at me. Sort of the aloha version of what is Hawaiian. I would get aloha and I would get tourist images of people kissing on the sunset or, doing this on the sunset, right? I found that though Hawaiians are the aloha people all over the world, whenever I typed aloha into the search engines, all I got were these cheesy photos. Advertisements for hotels. About 100 or so days into the first year, I began to totally steal the photos from my friends on Facebook to post as examples of these words of love. And then as I got deeper into the year, I realized that there were all these place names, wind and rain names, words about love, amazingly good sex, longing, desire, and intimacy, a lexicon of aloha, all these things, and that we were as a community are cut off from these experiences because when we would go on the internet, we never saw any of this reflected back to us. And then we're not reading the chants, or we don't understand Hawaiian, and a lot of people didn't know where was that place name? What does that bird look like? What is that plant? So after translating 100 or so songs, I realized that the forest was a great place of assignation for Hawaiians. Do you know what that means? It's the place that Hawaiians hooked up, the forest, right? So if you become save the Aina. I used to joke that the bumper sticker, the little meme-like sticker that says no Hawaiians, no aloha, has to be elongated to say no forest, no sex, no Hawaiians, then no aloha. So after doing this for a year and a half, so we've aggregated 500 versions, 500 different chants. My site sort of looks like this. A word a day, with an extended meditation on the words found in a song. Images of the place, or rain, or wind, or flower. Hawaiian people in love. My cousins on the far right. They're really hot. And an audio track. When I began this group, I only imagined that myself, the guy I was writing for who needed help, and a few of the people from my hula school would be, sort of checking this out. And now the page is up to about 3,085 followers. Which basically means it's surpassed my own circle of friends, so I don't know who these people are. People from France, the United States, New Zealand, Canada, hopefully Winnipeg now, Anishinaabe, I don't know, Switzerland, are now following, and the site has engendered a lot of discussion on mele. This is what was so unbelievable. People started asking questions about mele, translations. When was that song recorded? Who recorded that song first? The place names, the stories, the meanings of words. A virtual community of people interested in learning more about aloha. And this word here, awayaulu, it seems to, you want to say it means many waters. Wai is water, and that's why I put this, it's also a place name, waters overflowing to the point where they do that with the falls. But awayaulu is a way of binding. Bound is your love to me, like a tie. And there were so many words that I learned about binding. Binding for feathers, how you would sort of tie them together in clumps so that you could put them in feather lei. Binding for lei. All of these different allusions to how your relationship to me is extremely close. These are the kinds of things that I learned while doing this project. When longing for you comes upon me, it urges me to want to be with you again. That's what the translation in the top is. So I'll write some kind of extended meditation of the word followed by the chant there, and then stolen images from my friends' Facebook pages, and that totally awesome image from Your Name, which is an anime that I really love. Anyway, so I don't know where to take that next. It's living on Facebook right now. I kind of want it to do more than just sort of sit there as words on a page. So I'm kind of looking for people to sort of help me out with that. Now, this year we decided to dedicate to this idea of Aina, of land and love, because so much of the way that Hawaiians express their affection for one another happened through features of the land, the wind, and the rain. And this place, Ka'ala, we actually visited 4 times. It's the highest spot on Oahu Island. On the very top of it, it has a bog that is just all native forest. It's like completely, it's like the definition of pristine. And so we brought chanters up there so that they could actually experience the place, see all the different plants and these words, so that when they wanted to compose chants about these things, that they had an experience of it. And as you can see from the image here, Ka'ala is called in the chants that I pulled for it, a kilohana. It means a high spot from which you can see everything. So this is sort of my image when I think about visioning or seeing far. This is Ka'ala with the Milky Way over it. And you know Hawaiians, as like all the people in the Pacific, traverse the ocean, seas, and space through a map of stars. So for me, that place is some kind of, somebody said portal today. The words for me are that, but a place of connectivity, of moving and seeing into the future. So, I wanted to move from there to, I forgot that this is backwards. From there, I wanted to go back to talk about the game that we made together. So this is the group of people that we worked together with on the game. All these smiling people with the name Na'anai Mahiki, or leaping fish, that Kawila gave it to the group. We worked together for 3 intense weeks, thinking through mo'olelo, coming up with story, moving from there to storyboards, characters, creating code, designing the levels or environment of the game, audio, animation, and cinematics in 3 weeks. We prayed, ate, drank together, we made relationships, and then we made a game. Now, I wanted to be part of the Skins project because I was interested in further building digital performances, but this time through gaming, in order to proliferate ways to tell histories or stories, kind of like some kind of bridge activity to what I'm doing with 365 into another format. I'm interested in what games can do pedagogically to transform how we learn oral and written tradition, how we authenticate knowledge as truth-bearing, which is a big problem after sort of the ravages of colonialism, and as how do we make it as part of the code that Rila talked about yesterday in her talk. And more recently, I'm interested in how we might build games that engage players to iterate or perform processes that support and inculcate Hawaiian values and behaviors that carry over into life practice. My question was, can games or digital mediums help us familiarize ourselves with native subjectivities, our own internality, emotional and intimate? Can these worlds that we create become a safe space of practice, repetition, of visioning, that kilohana that I showed you, from which we may see ourselves, be and feel ourselves, and see far? The work that we did was really challenging. The story of Heauho, you get to play it, I think, this weekend? Yeah. So kind of began for me in that corner slide where people are talking. Skawanati's there, Kawila, Brother Vance, Janine, who's also in the audience. When somebody, Kawila talked about we're sending Hawaiians into space. And we would say, well, why would we go to space? We had that conversation. Why are we going? And at some point, somebody suggested that Hawaiians leave Earth because we run out of resources. And so we need to go into space and mine or harvest what we need. And that's the day we had a great multi-sided discussion about how, well, that sort of sounds like a familiar trope in colonial narratives, right? You run out, you need to go someplace, you need to strip mine something to bring it back, and just sort of take. And we began to ask, well, how would Hawaiians go into space, and why? And we had that important first discussion about indigenizing the game. And those discussions just kept happening over the course of 1 to 2 weeks. And somebody on earlier panel said that the future is not singular, it's communal. And that's the kind of stuff that we're doing here through this process. As a historian, mostly I'm sitting in an archive like by myself, listening to the voices I'm reading, but this process sort of forces me out of my comfort zone and into this broader discussion of how will we do that as a community? And how would we imagine our community engaging with that gameplay and seeing themselves through that moment? How space exploration might move us beyond the sort of authenticating practices that dictate that nativity is to be rooted to one place, and sort of playing with that idea of ayaka'aina iloko, that the land is inside of me, that I carry home with me wherever I go. The tension for me as a historian, though, and as a writer is, how do I take the raw material of the oral and written, that center side, the stuff that I deal with, and text and translate, embed, or evoke the important elements that would make the story identifiably and true to those codes that are Hawaiian? I had to figure out, and I'm still attempting to do this, how much of the prescriptions or kapu of how we were taught were tied up in the auditory method of the way knowledge was imparted to us. Also, as Jason says, programming is a writerly practice, Noi just wants to know, really, how much of this programming stuff do I have to learn in order to feel at ease in this new medium as someone capable of creating? This slide kind of shows my process. My friend Ahukini Romero is an artist and a sculptor, and he starts, this is called mo'olelo, multiple sorts of, mo'olelo means speech, but it means strands of olelo sort of connected over time. So like genealogical successions of speech acts. And, okay, I'll stop soon. This Iolani Luahine is chanting, it's auditory. It's going through the printing press into the wax cylinders of the late 19th century to record the first Hawaiian voices. Then from there into the typewriters, and then the computer, and then back to the auditory. So for me, gameplay, what it does for me is, I'm thinking, I figured our ancestors kept mo'olelo alive for 900 years without pen and paper, 200 years about with pen and paper, and now younger people are used to this idea that all knowledge might live on their smartphone. But the problem in Hawaii, as I have written in my work as a historian, is not source scarcity, but source abundance. How do I take complex chants and mo'olelo and move them into digital territory? How can we offer people the experience of performance, auditory or kinesthetic, when the mediums are largely privileging the visual? And what to do with my love of words that make the world, when a rising meme or Twitter culture has turned reading practices into short or long reads. So really quickly, we've put images in here that are the God forms. So we have double meaning or kauna, which I'm used to like referring to in text, now embodied in the visual. The kukui of Kamapua'a is a symbol of the God, and it means enlightenment. And this is where I'm going to end, where we incorporate the video of someone chanting his name chant as he lays waste to this area. And the player has to hit him with enough of these nuts of enlightenment to open his eyes, so he realizes that he's actually a man and not a pig. Mahalo ya oko.
I think we all should book a flight to Hawaii.
Yes.
Hi. I'd like to thank the organizers for continuing to include me in these discussions. I really appreciate it. And of course, the ancestors of this land. There's just no way that I can follow this amazing panel, since my presentation is anchored in a very different set of questions but still around the question of decolonial tools. And so this is an installation that was done for the inaugural exhibit of the NMAI. And all of these ceramic pieces stand in for communities and ancestors that we no longer have direct connections to. And so one of the complications that I'm considering in my work is just the fact that there are over 3,000 different indigenous peoples, communities, discrete communities in just the Americas. We're not even considering the larger space of how many indigenous peoples there are in the world. And so it's interesting how these numbers and the realization of indigenous space is such an opaque or almost invisible space, and yet for us, it is so visible, it is so present. And so I'm interested in what it means to change that circumstance. So, you're probably already familiar with the Haudenosaunee saying, "The face is yet unseen," or more often referred to as thinking about the next 7 generations. It occurs to me that this phrase is evidence that the Haudenosaunee were always thinking about the future. In fact, concern for the face is yet unseen is a philosophical tenet of Haudenosaunee thought that is meant to underpin or inform every decision made with the consideration of the faces yet unseen in the future. The provocation of considering how to decolonize technology must also reinforce the idea that indigenous people were technologists historically and continue to engage with technology today. Vine Deloria asserted this idea in the early 1970s, and Dr. Duke Redberg opened this conference with an inspirational lecture that recognized indigenous systems of knowledge. What are the factors that continue to subjugate or undermine indigenous futurity? I argue there remains a latent projection of primitivism onto indigenous peoples that continues to delegitimize our systems of thought. Everyone is arguing against polemic binaries like Western, non-Western, but until the power differentials of the North-South divide or ongoing colonialism is abated, we need to pay attention to the terminology in use. As a strategy for self-empowerment, we often use the language of indigenous knowledge instead of the outmoded terminology of worldview. We call for the recognition of multiple epistemes and sometimes find the turn to ontology a useful framing. But last week at the Whitney Museum in New York City, as I was walking through the now controversial Jimmy Durham exhibition, I was struck by the importance of this work in pointing out the force of colonization, but the aesthetic tone of the work was articulated through a very primitivistic lens. The use of found, natural, and human-made object forms the core of materials in use by the artist. I challenged myself to go back through the exhibition and look for an artwork that gestured or informed an inheritance or insight into indigenous place-based knowledge. I recognize the practice or method of Durham is the inheritance, but the conceptual tone is in dialogue with broader artistic category of primitivistic art, and the public is very receptive. I recognize that this is not the intent of the artist, but rather the limits of the ability for a non-native public to see beyond its own perceptions of arrested development for indigenous cultures. But I wonder what the overall reception will be of a recent exhibition that opened last month at the NMAI in New York City, just 2 subway stops down from the Whitney. The exhibition, titled Transformers, Native Art and Light and Sound, is curated by NMAI curator Kathleen Ash-Milby with invited collaborator David Garneau. The curatorial objective of exploring how indigenous artists are engaging with various technologies acts as a dynamic counterpoint to the Durham exhibition at the Whitney. A specific contrast for me was embodied with the work of Marianne Nicholson. Installed in a single room, the work is reminiscent of Nicholson's other projections. In this case, the halogen bulb and mechanism and etched glass projected the designs on the wall, making the entire room a box. As described by Nicholson, the box is based on traditional bentwood storage chests of the Pacific Northwest coast. It exists as a metaphor for the house as container for people and the land as container for community. The pictograph images reference original writing on the land by indigenous peoples and their ancient connections and beliefs. But I was also struck by the work of Anishinaabe Métis artist Julie Nagam's piece, but wasn't able to capture the action of the media projection, but argue that both artists demonstrated within their work a sense of the term place-based knowledge. Within the frame of indigenous knowledge, place-based knowledge is a central framing for the practice of observational science. Indigenous peoples developed strategic technologies over millennia to live in an environment and translated these observations into inventive materials, including the metaphoric articulation of these ideas within the tradition of narrative stories. But the complexity resides in the fact that we live in fluid spaces with multiple epistemes, histories, and imbalanced power differentials that require an orchestration of multiple strategies to break the representational code. The codes that I'm referring to exist within the museum archive, historic documents, community memory, and contemporary art. We continue to wrestle the interpretation of indigenous culture from the past through our artistic expression, a critical analysis of the literature, and active participation with the teachings with the preferred model of engagement as being collaborative, not extractive. But is it enough? Most recently, I've begun to look at how the West, or mainstream, is attempting to move beyond a binary of objects or things being alive or dead, having agency or not, and how it is discussed. This past semester, I developed and taught a class titled Indigeneity and Materiality. In this class, I considered materials as willful agents within artistic processes across key moments in history marking indigenous place, space, bodies, and land. I argue that the introduction of multiple modernities structures the shift from art historical framings over form over matter and connoisseurship to viewing materiality as an active process that continues to map larger social processes and transformation, just a class you all want to take.
Go to Connect.
But I was wrong about the state of Western theory. At this conference, I noted that several presentations confirmed the use of this strategy as part of decolonization, but also empowerment, specifically the Dechencha Bush University and the Dene, I believe it's Naho. In order to have the conversation to accomplish this, I have to build an argument that recognizes the limits or misrepresentations of indigenous philosophy or worldview due to the impact of colonization. And I'll point to some recent observations amongst Haudenosaunee knowledge holders that indicate a need for better intellectual tools to discuss our cultural matter or material culture. And I will share some art and material culture case studies to test my observations. I promise to do this all in 10 minutes or less and leave time for your thoughts and observations. The connection between legitimizing our understanding of history and the ongoing formulation of knowledge relates directly to an indigenous future. The prophetic Gnoniok or Great Law, the creation or beginning story, and the visionary message of Handsome Lake or Gaiweo reinforce this space. And so what I would really appreciate is every person here actually provided, or we had someplace, a repository, where we could put in play what are the philosophical chapters of your experience of your peoples that we need to know about in order to read this work, because that's what I'm laying out for the Haudenosaunee. It's difficult and I think inappropriate to have this discussion from a generic perspective, and that's why I'm not suggesting Haudenosaunee are the only knowledge holders, but this is my area of research and my personal experience. Understanding that in order to fully embrace Haudenosaunee artwork, one needs to be familiar with these storied yet philosophical framings of our existence. This is one of the issues with delving deeper into understanding Indigenous art. It requires an investment in knowledge structures beyond the West. I'm fatigued with the familiar gloss of these ideas. Terms like magical realism, animism, enchantment are all attempts at maintaining a mythical distance from reality and continue to undermine our Indigenous knowledge systems. The integration of the word, enactment through ceremony, and the embodiment or teachings of philosophy reimagined through material or physical objects ranging from wampum to video form the body of Haudenosaunee reality. Therefore, the authority of how these objects or materials are understood is directly connected to an Indigenous future and our ongoing production of a Haudenosaunee way of being, and I would substitute your own nation in that sentence. Recently, Ganundigan was the backdrop for Rekindling the Fire, a think tank experience for Haudenosaunee women that took place in August. Organized by Mohawk Bear Clan mother Louise McDonald, key ideas were shared that mirror conversations in theoretical and Western-based science communities. And so, could you run the media, please? So you're all familiar with Skawanade's work. This is that moment of transformation, of the descent or ascent from one world to another. And each of us has this moment in our cultures. And what this relates to is a much larger discussion about the role that women are playing at present in our communities in reimagining this future. So we'll watch her jump and then we'll... Just amazing.
And finally, to sleep.
Okay, we can stop it here. Thank you. Mohawk elders Katsy Cook and Beverly Jacobs' insightful description of the moment in the creation story that Sky Women's transition to this world is a metaphor for the reproduction cycle. And so what I'm trying to point out is that these stories are the metaphors that our ancestors used to bring this knowledge forward. What we're looking for at this period of time, I think, are the architectonic structures of these stories. And we're doing this in a couple ways. And so this is an installation that I did called the 13 Moon Garden, or Othan Yeha. And if you could run the media piece on this. In collaboration with my daughter, Mia McKee and Waylon Wilson, both from Tuscarora. And so the back of the carpus of the turtle has 13 tiles. And so our calendar, which I was responding with the Hawaiian calendar as well, actually has 13 moons, not 12. And I think the recovery or reinvestment in this framing of time is part of the work of this deeper knowledge. So the immersive space of the singing to the seeds already have their instructions. And so the song actually activates or wakes up or brings forward the knowledge in the seed. So Alex Jacobs, a poet from the Mohawk Akwesasne community, actually wrote a poem about the fact that the knowledge is in the seed. And so the seed is both Sky Woman from the upper world, the sky world, and in this case, the seeds that are planted throughout this entire world. So we could stop that piece, okay? So Diane Hill, a healer from Six Nations, emphasized the ability of human beings to heal after severe emotional trauma. She recalled the significance of these teachings about condolence in this process. So this is just the, so this is planted in the complex, the well-known complex of the Haudenosaunee Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, and this is the garden in fruition. And then this was the harvest. And so what was interesting for me about this is that the squash that was recovered actually from a seed exchange that my daughter and husband attended at Six Nations was the orange Buffalo Creek squash. And I think this is going out through all our territories because we don't preserve our knowledge about the world around us, we practice it. And that's how we move the knowledge forward. And so that's really what this installation was about. So this idea that we have the ability, that there's everything in this world to heal ourselves is something that I'm going to come back to in a moment. And so I just want to point out that there's a number of people that are doing exciting work around this. Dr. Adams, analysis of the plants mentioned in the creation story, both historicize it and reimagine the biome. But to the question of language, most recently, the presentation of Tuscarora plant biologist Dr. Jane Mott Pleasant, who I think is somebody that you could follow up on if you want to understand both the scientific and the Haudenosaunee relationship of the Three Sister planting, or it's called, it sustains us, or Johenko in the Seneca language, has been working in collaboration with Onondaga linguist Dr. Kevin Conley on the words that come before all else, the Thanksgiving address, or Ganoniak, which Jason and Skawanati shared with us at the beginning, albeit their own version of it, which seeks to recover a sense of Haudenosaunee expressions of matter. And so all of these thinkers recognize the parallel and entangled thought with the technological and scientific discourse. They're not trying to validate Haudenosaunee knowledge through Western science, but are practicing an established indigenous framework of observational research. In part, they are gesturing toward a more assertive analysis of our traditions as material culture and not only literary metaphor. Linguists are reanimating indigenous languages, but how does the discussion about material culture and art recover a deeper understanding about the active matter or power or presence? And is there ever a condition when an object or artwork is active matter or alive? For instance, Kevin is deconstructing the translations offered by non-native scholars Hanny Woodbury and Marianne Methuen as missing foundational understandings about grammatical and semantic principles expressed in linguistics as animacy. An elementary principle of language, animacy, is referring to sentient or how alive the referent or a noun is. The breakdown of the idea is that a sentient being is a person, animal, or maybe even a worm. Through a close reading of Ganoniak, Kevin argues that a tree is not a noun, but an action, which he describes as treeness. These thinkers are reanimating a Haudenosaunee worldview that is suspiciously parallel to what some theorists anchored in Western philosophy, media studies, anthropology, sociology, and art history are currently debating as materiality. And so, what do historic Native American objects understood as beings, belongings, and grandfathers want today? Recently, a colleague at Bard invited me to participate in a symposium titled Conserving Active Matter. Quoted from the announcement for their conference, Bard situated the discussion about active matter to inform the theory and practice of conservation as the following. The symposium will balance 21st century technologies by historicizing the past. The example used was from the New York Times this past summer that reported on scientists implanting a digital video in a bacterium's DNA and turning a living creature and its descendants into a storage device. Precisely Jason's point about how we treat or what is the relationship to these technologies. This is balanced by an investigation of active matter through the lenses of material science, history, philosophy, and indigenous ontologies, which never made the assumption that matter was inactive. This last point, that indigenous ontologies, or the philosophy of the study of the nature of being, asserts that matter or material culture is alive. This critical intervention by Aaron Glass and allied anthropologists researching the cultures of the Northwest Coast pushed open a space to include indigenous perspectives within Bard's 5-year Mellon-funded discussion on active matter. The motivation behind this research is about developing new questions to address how to conserve active matter within the archive. A number of conservators and art historians problematize the challenge to conserve artworks made of materials that are not stable. So the discussion ran from Nanjuk Pak all the way to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Observations made by a conservator from the National Museum of the American Indian complicated the issues faced by the effort to conserve the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are animal hides, when dealing with indigenous materials. Today, the standard practice is to consult with knowledgeable peoples in our communities to develop a care and conservation plan for various objects, sometimes referred to as ancestors or beings. The unmarked, not yet quantified space or the ontological gaps were described as accommodating by continuing to allow persons from our communities to come in and feed the objects, meaning that there has been an acknowledgement that museums will now allow the objects to be danced, smudged, and put in the company of knowledge holders from communities. But I do not think this signals that there has been a shift and an acceptance of indigenous relationships to these objects. It's been over 10 years since theorist Bill Brown brought forward a discussion about human-object interactions that he described as thing theory. This provocation is in dialogue with Bruno Latour's work on the actor network theory and political theorist Jane Bennett's notion of vibrant matter, which is basically an argument that everything is alive, interconnected, and in process, not only plants and humans, but rocks and air. But this is not what indigenous peoples mean by interconnectedness or relationships. Allied scholars Jessica Horton and Janet Berlow in 2013 recognized that, quote, the diversity of work shares a basic conviction that matter, whether it's in the forest or in the lab, has agency, can move, act, assume volition, and even enjoy degrees of intelligence. often assumed to be the unique domain of human activity, end quote. But none of this represents, but none of these theorists or historians in this category privilege indigenous ways of knowing. To put a finer point on this, to go back to Kevin Conley's assertion that embedded within polysynthetic languages like Onondaga, nouns are more like verbs, making a Haudenosaunee construction of reality closer to what physicists today have found on the molecular level, that everything is in motion, not inert or inactive or dead. But the difference between indigenous expressions of the idea that the earth is alive is in sharp contrast to the way the technological West is grappling with active matter. Hear this: the authority is still located within the language of science or the West. Although scholars at Bard signal that they acknowledge that indigenous people recognize energy in every living thing, it does not mean that they accept it or are creating even a parallel space for this perspective to exist. These observations are connected to a series of provocative theories that seek to reanimate the West's scientific and philosophical understanding of matter. Philosopher Liz Gross cautions that these reductions and divisions occur only at a cost, which is the failure or inability of our scientific, representational, and linguistic systems to acknowledge the in-between of things, the plural interconnections that cannot be utilized or contained within and by things, but that makes them possible. And so I've been working, and some of you have seen this before, but I've been working on the visualization of the molecular level and indigenous representations. And so I'm struck by the fact in this case that the white pine, which you saw the physical representation of the white pine, and then the wampum representation of the white pine, which this particular belt, the ever-growing tree belt or the wing, is really about understanding a consciousness of peace. And that at the molecular level, we see what the cellular structure of the white pine looks like. And it's interesting to me that this structure is the foundational structure for wampum, set on a binary system, one could argue, that forms the Haudenosaunee visualization of our consciousness. And so I think that this is but probably one example of many that we could begin to surface that our ancestors, through observational practice, understood this universe both at a micro and macro level. But that understanding, because it's been placed in narrative traditions, and the traditions are metaphoric, has been reduced to, and I'm not saying this in a pejorative way, but this idea of story work. And this idea of story is very easy today to dismiss these ideas or knowledge as fact. And this is a video feedback piece by Greg Stotts, also on wampum. A string of wampum hangs, the video shoots it, it feeds it back. And it's part of a larger work, if you could run the media piece, it's part of a larger work that is about the role of wampum as part of a restorative aesthetic. Okay. Okay, thank you. Let's see. Seneca scholar John Mohawk thoughts about relations that are expressed in a way that I argue is not taken up seriously as a form of observational science. He wrote, "Thus, are the grasses and trees that exist upon the Mother Earth both real and spiritual beings? They exist, and they exist in a way that follows the ways of the creation. They also make life as we know it in this place. If the grasses cease to follow the way of the creation, if they cease to grow and provide food for the other things of this place, life as we know it may cease. It is an energy force that has great power, but for the grasses, there is a power to heal and a power to bring beauty. The grasses hold the earth together, and they are beings to which the animal life is tied. It is their way of being, that they are spiritual participants in the process that is life in this creation. Thus, life as we know it depends upon the spirit of the grasses, that their spirits be kept strong and powerful, and that they be able to maintain balance on the earth. Science currently has the methodological tools and protocols to measure why our observations about the grasses are true, but at present, it is unwilling to bridge the ontological gap and deal with the question of spirit. The question of philosophies based on relationships is at the core of indigenous knowledge, and in a wonderful and quirky way, I recognize that Jason Lewis, Skawanati, Julie Nagam, and the Indigenous Futures Collective have been a driving force in creating this space. It is actually an early piece of software that Jason authored, Mr. Softy, that he enabled humans to touch technology. Thank you for showing those earlier. A typographic text editor and POEMM interactive and dynamic text framework for an iOS application. Today, we're all comfortable with interacting with touch technology, but when Professor Lewis developed these software applications, they inspired a shift in our relationship to the fixity of text, understanding text also having an emotive quality beyond its signographic heritage. I see this as a form of reverse engineering or a decolonial tool. This begs the question, what's it going to take for indigenous relational matter to carry the same authority as the West's idea, active matter? And I'll just put this on. It was a little piece I did. You could play it. That's about how it's about how, amongst Haudenosaunee, we maintain our kinship system through the mother's line.
Florence, Helen, Harriet, Mary, Margaret, Margaret, Yekisud Gehatneg, Margaret, Yekisud Gehatneg, Mary, Yekisud Gehatneg, Harriet, Yekisud Gehatneg, Helen, Uksud, Florence, Uksud, Sally, Uksud, Lena, Gadutrarit, Jolene, Yecheneti, Mia, Yerihuayetus, Yerihuayetus, Yecheneti, Gadutrarit.
So there are three levels: the colonial names, the pronunciation of our names within the as L2 speakers, and then the recovery of our indigenous names. And so all of the materials that I've woven into this braid are part of the materials that helped us to survive on the journey of our dispossession from North Carolina 300 years ago. So nyawa.
Okay. So, I don't think we actually have any time for questions, but we can definitely stick around and you guys can come up and ask these amazing panelists a few things. I do want to say Chimagwich and Marcy for bringing your good minds and good hearts here today and for really stimulating everybody's ideas and thoughts and creativity. I really hope that everybody comes to the opening at Urban Shaman at 290 McDermott. It's kind of a weird door. For those of you who've not been there, you actually have to open this heavy door and go up a flight or two of stairs and you will see it. Usually Dana has a nice sign outside. So please come. It will be lots of fun. Also, too, please come back to the video game and VR arcade. It's from 11 a.m. till 2 p.m. You can still come and see the exhibition at the same time if you'd like to do that, or maybe you're not as excited to play the games, but I know lots of people are. Also, too, the VR works will be fun. So I want to thank everybody for coming, and yeah, have a great night.